Hello, I'm Micah Tewers. Very glad to be with you all. Thank you, Evrim, Charles, and Hilan for putting this symposium together. For recording purposes, the time is 12:48 p.m. on the 16th of September, 2024, and we are at the Senate House in London, England, the United Kingdom, Europe, Earth, Solar System, Milky Way, Universe, Outer Limits, TBD. Looking back at speculative realism, one of the stickiest critiques that I've heard again and again is that it ultimately abstracts us from concrete concerns over justice, that it distracts us with epistemological, ontological inventions while the world around us burns. And this is not merely a contemporary concern for those surviving our modern crises. One may well argue that the original theme of philosophy itself was justice. Even excluding the original canon of proto-philosophical holy texts, which nearly always double as divine laws, the very first fragments of philosophical prose show Anaximander describing the order of the universe as a justice system. And he says, "All things go through trials and pay penalties for their injuries, in accordance with the justice of time." Interestingly, this philosophical conception of justice was built around the term dike, which literally translates to watercourse, a structure built to guide flows and prevent flooding. As Heidegger describes it, the idea implies a jointure through division, opposed to the unified jointure of harmony, which is, the etymology is close to like the shoulder joint. By dike, the walls of law hold the chaos of life within certain bounds. We see this watercourse vision of justice serve as a rich analogical resource for thinking through the play or proper order of being and becoming, the bounded and boundless, the necessary and contingent. We see each aspect, respectively, defended by Parmenides and Heraclitus. We see the term used to describe judges in ancient courtrooms drawing lines in the sand between innocence and guilt, true and false testimony. Pythagoras similarly draws a table of opposites, separating positive and negative, good and evil, light and darkness, male and female. Indeed, Jordan Peterson is still a Pythagorean. This metaphor of jointure through division comes in handy, but the point here is that we see the primary concept of justice develop through the history of philosophy. From these earliest attempts to Socrates' more sophisticated demand for ever higher justification beyond the justice of the sophists, to Plato's grand attempt to unify truth and justice over a divided line, and continuing up through modernity. It's in Hobbes' notion of sovereignty, Rousseau's primitive innocence, Kant's tribunal of reason, as well as Nietzsche's revaluation of all values after the death of the highest judge. Finally, we see it develop through post-Kantian philosophies, which take freedom, equality, and justice as keys to a new epoch of justice, from Fichte, Hegel, Marx, de Beauvoir, to the doctrine of beneficence I see built into pragmatism, and even Foucault's insistence that justice perpetually demands we question justice. It is therefore imperative we ask, does this prime lens of philosophy come to a close with speculative realism? With this essay in the book, I set out to retrieve answers to the question of justice from the initial four theorists who appeared under the name speculative realism, and I tried to display these answers as plainly and simply as I can, so they might stick. We'll interpret the efforts of the original four speculative realists as justice philosophies, namely, through a reformulation of their common enemy in terms of its perceived injustices. That is, what are the injustices of correlationism? That disturbingly persuasive argument that we cannot think reality independent of its correlation with human thought. In a word, we find that all four accuse correlationism of failing to do justice to reality. First off, there's Ray Brazier's transcendental nihilism. Now, hardly anything would seem more acidic to the idea of justice than the notion that existence is meaningless. But in the dense pages of his book Nihil Unbound, we find that nothing is more essential for Brazier than the tribunal of reason itself. For him, nihilism is not merely the opinion that existence is worthless, but rather the proper name for the cutting edge of reason, which alone pierces through the vibrant fog of delusion, appearance, and false testimony, which obstruct an honest view of reality in itself. Indeed, even Plato famously stated that the worst injustice is false justice. Thus, the line of humankind's intellectual progress, on Brazier's account, is a series of disenchanting negations, which place an irreversible stranglehold on what we can justifiably posit as the case. The clear heroes, I can't open my water bottle, here we go. The clear heroes of such progress have been the great critics, scientists, and materialists like Copernicus, Kant, Darwin, Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, who irrevocably uncovered that we are not in fact the center of the solar system, that the beginning was not a word, but a bang, that humans are equally animals, that the socio-moral order was not set up by God, but by conflicts of class and power, and that even our own conscious intellects are ruled by unconscious forces. And rather than being bewailed as a debilitating impoverishment, Brazier thinks this disenchantment of the world, I quote, deserves to be celebrated as an achievement of intellectual maturity. Humanity is growing up. Nihilism is no longer an existential quandary, but a speculative opportunity, he says. But while the outright justifications of myth and dogma are certainly a target on which to unleash the forces of critical thought, they are far from being the most insidious enemy of our time. Since the advent of Kant's era-defining critiques, there have emerged many sheep in wolves' clothing, and it's correlationism which provides the cloth. This is because the correlationist defense strategy consists in exchanging pre-critical belief with post-critical suspicion. And while a critically informed skepticism might seem like a natural ally to this annihilating project, Brazier wisely points out how this surface-level similarity gives strength to this modern enemy of truth. The agnosticism regarding the status of reality by the correlationist makes it so that no two claims, no two testimonies, can any longer be weighed against one another, as both will be equally presumed as unknowable for us. This equality of unknowing between, say, the materialist and mythic accounts serves an elaborate excuse from standing trial in the tribunal of reason, exonerating all frauds. In a word, correlationism is a critically informed self-justification. He further points out that previous materialisms have failed to overcome this issue. For instance, Nietzsche's will, which universally reduces truth claims to physiological accounts of power, ends up being used to bolster the very idols one wished to topple. As one can now say, again, Jordan Peterson does this, that the belief in God need not be true in itself, but merely a powerful belief for us. See that sleight of hand? We have yet to do justice to the disrobing power of reason. Brazier goes so far as to say that the work of disillusionment is never complete. Ontology ought to be a continuous study. As an aside, I'd say that Heidegger got the general outline of this target drawn right, but instead of opening a new depth for thought, he sort of painted a black wall and called it being. Now, in order to do justice to reality in itself, Brazier suggests that we take our grubby human fingers off the scales, always tipping them in our favor. And it's at this point that he proposes a speculative test for philosophical realism, to think the ordinance of existence beyond the jurisdiction of conscious life, by contemplating an age where we do not exist and will not return. The purpose of this thought is to draw a hard line between reality and consciousness, to see the latter as entirely contingent. From this vantage point, Brazier gives a number of uncomfortable insights onto what matter is beyond what matters for us. And in the reflection of this thought of extinction, we are already dead. Now, one may be wondering, what could this possibly offer to a conversation of justice? Will the obliviating truth somehow set us free? There appears to remain a sliver of something akin to hope in his work. Foremost, Brazier draws our attention to the manner in which we allow myths and ghosts to legislate our present world, and says this generally renders philosophy, he says, as an apologia for the status quo at best, and a rationalization for oppression at worst. And he suggests that breaking free of such common delusions could unleash a new Promethean politics, making making us capable of reimagining ourselves and our world on a more rational basis, where humanity is no longer constrained by artificial limits on what is possible for it to achieve. He believes that philosophy, which allows itself to be fully traumatized by reality, strives to become equal to the trauma of the in itself whose trace it bears. We are asked whether we might seize the radical contingency we encounter in humanity in the thought of extinction. For instance, he notes that deconstructing the very experience of selfhood as a contingent delusion could lend itself to new notions of agency and property. What he has in mind here is a communist project constituted by rationally selfless subjects. Indeed, within the grand scope of extinction, all are made equal under the universality of our eventual death. Yet I must admit I'm a bit perplexed by his practical recommendations here. And maybe Malaspina, her work can help us here, because in some places Brasier states that the proliferation of a kind of anti-meaningful noise is needed to disrupt world capital. But elsewhere he says that world capital literally runs on the proliferation of such noise. Perhaps even more centrally, even though I agree with the results, I've not found his reasons for affirmatively justifying, from the standpoint of nihilism, the communist ethos over, say, a sadistically capitalist ethos. He elusively writes, even, that what is just cannot simply be what is justifiable. But beyond justifications for justice, how are we to rationally organize here? And if Brasier continues to hold that the feelings of joy, beauty, and goodness are no valid criterion for justifying justice, then how exactly is justice's negative formulation as a reaction to injury and death any better? For what difference could it all make to a nihilist who sees us as already dead? Nevertheless, Brasier's project leaves us with a remarkably salient question regarding the human drive for justice. If the threat of total annihilation from the universe doesn't light a fire in us, what will? I look forward to Evrim's presentation, if you touch on speculative optimism. Now, let's move on to Ian Hamilton Grant's formulation. According to Grant, the greatest injustice to the history of philosophy is certainly physiocide. That is, philosophers, especially the last few hundred years, are guilty of trying to murder nature. He is especially inspired by the nature philosophy of Schelling here, who he says struck at the ethical heart of all modern philosophy. And we'll try to find where this heart lies. As mentioned, Grant's project prosecutes all claims that nature is finished, that we humans have finally escaped nature through superior self-consciousness and science, and that the end of nature has already taken place, that we're already functionally dead. Instead, he maintains that one of the few precious absolutes that we can glean about reality is that this is certainly not the case. Reaching for a glass, he cheerfully said to a crowd, and I need this too, "I'm glad the universe isn't over, because then I wouldn't be able to have a sip of water. I've had a sip of water, therefore the universe isn't over." Similarly, the idea of creation has been abandoned by philosophers, scared of being confused with anti-naturalists. And although, I quote, "holding a concept of creation is likely to expose us to accusations of theologism," Grant finds a realistic defense of creation here, as each act, doubt, passing comet, and gust of wind bears witness to the fact that the creation of the world did not occur at the beginning of time, but occurs every day, as Marcel Proust once put it. Although the problem of correlationism hardly appears in Grant's work, it seems this is because he discerns it to be merely the new malnourished offspring of irresponsible parents more deserving of the blame, for the murder of nature, that is, namely, reductive materialism and subjectivist idealism. You will already notice a sharp contrast from the fiercely negative philosophy just covered. As an alternative to Brazier's annihilating procedure, which radicalizes dialectical logic to do justice to reason, Grant pursues an unapologetically positive approach, specifically in order to do justice to the reality which produces reason in the first place. Nature precedes and exceeds reason. Contra Brazier, Grant argues that eliminative materialism fails to account for the abundant processes of purposive organization. Grant's philosophy is decisively inflationary. But Grant is just as antagonistic to humanism, ethicism, and subjectivism, which all place the mind as if it's somehow outside of nature. These notions neglect that consciousness is inextricably a part, an expression, an expansion of nature to and within itself. We may even say that this reduction of reality to a ground or game for humans was the first bad idea of nature. Instead of these, we need a theory capable of articulating at once the strange nature of freedom, which exceeds all critical reductions, and the freedom of nature, which overcomes this hubris of human subjectivity. Thus, the task is to unify realist parts with idealist wholes, he says, in a speculative physics of everything. This does not entail that ideas are automatically doomed to do an injustice to nature. Again, they are a legitimate part of nature. Ideas are not the way that we transcend into another world. Ideas are the self-augmentation of the real. He notes, conceptual genesis and natural genesis become one. In other words, nature auto-produces itself. The concept of creation is a genuine instance of creation. Contrary to the damning revelation of the already ended here, Grant proposes a brand new secular vision of an always beginning Genesis. Ultimately, any complete philosophy of nature cannot merely chase down observable laws, but must finally get down to the beating heart of this legislation itself. Consequently, Grant's work draws out nature's jurisdiction beyond all judgments and laws, for the autonomy of nature literally means the self-legislation of all its laws. We follow the very immanence of law by the ontogenesis of the whole. This nature, always producing necessity and contingency together, refuses any ontological stalemate, any end to the ontogenetic production of nature. And Hilon will correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe there's a strong parallel to Whitehead's concept of concretion here. But while we are thankfully pried away from the reductions of nature to mechanical laws or lawless chaos by this immanent self-legislating nature, we might yet ask, is there anything to do with ethical justice here? Beyond the axiom that nature is titled a supreme legislator, the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner, what does nature want but its continual reproduction? Is the biggest crisis in the world that some people conceptually disregard nature? We do not get such answers or questions in Grant's philosophy thus far. However, one may extrapolate from Schelling's own philosophy or attempt to read in this defense of nature a kind of meta-ethic. And doing this, one could propose that the imperative is to treat the parts as we do the whole, and avoid the ethical versions of subjective inflation and objective deflation, which is, I think, solipsism and nihilism, respectively. And to see to it that nature literally does not end. But again, this can only be hypothetically abstracted from the work. Now, among the original speculative realists, Graham Harmon's object-oriented ontology is certainly the easiest to summarize. To quote, "I defend the integrity, the autonomy of objects, from all qualities, all relations, and all possible uses that can be made of them." Unquote. The original sin of philosophy, according to Harmon, has been our giving in to the temptation to get rid of objects, preferring our models instead. The grand hopes of building some ultimate tribunal of reason or burrowing down to the infinite well of nature's own sovereignty are traded for a philosophy which prioritizes the justness of discrete things in their own right. For Harmon, both materialism and idealism must be destroyed. Such philosophies, he argues, have been built upon negative and positive variations of an all too seductive fundamentalism, either dissolving things down to constituent parts, undermining, up to their relational effects, overmining, or both extremes at once, duomining, as is notably the case with correlationism. And in correlationism, humans become the fundamental ontological decay in the cosmos, crudely updating the old theological duality of creator-creation with humans versus literally everything else. To finally break up these crude fundaments, Harmon proposes a flat ontology, which we may think of as a principle of fairness. Under this proposal, objects are not exiled as phantoms nor injuries to an otherwise seamless world, but rather, all things are given a hearing, and so, at least initially, treated equally. This already flies us far from Grant's view, where the freedom of the parts is seemingly swallowed up by the autonomy of the whole. Rather, the singular qualification for autonomy is a thing's mere irreducibility to any other for Harmon. Each being is a whole. Unlike the others we have covered, let us hit the most challenging critique of O right off the bat. Despite O's enormous success in its battles against the common doxa of fundamentalist and subjectivist metaphysics, it has also run into a threat seeking to disqualify it as real philosophy. The major accusation leveled is that O, object-oriented ontology, abandons science and critical justification wholesale, slipping into an epistemological anti-realism built on groundless aestheticism, one which affords no rights to assert one claim as truer than any other. As one might already have anticipated, these arguments are offered primarily from the corner of Brazier's tribunal of rationality. Brazier writes concerning O, "The denigration of rationality often serves as an alibi for those seeking to evade the obligation to justify their philosophical claims, but this is precisely the obligation that no philosopher can shirk." Putting aside Brazier's own claim that justice cannot be justified, it is indeed true that Harmon claims that, quote, "no one is actually in possession of final knowledge or truth." And while Brazier agrees with this, he claims it is because there's always a remaining residual fiction for us to cut through, while for Harmon, it is because things can never become equal to their theory, model, or translation. He writes, "The concreteness of objects refers to something so real that no description or definition ever does it justice. For O, it is by admitting we cannot do justice to things that we make the best initial move toward such a goal." Harmon traces the origin of philosophia, pointing out exactly this, that, quote, "philosophy has great cognitive value even though it is not a form of knowledge. Western philosophy emerged after the physicists through Socrates' discovery that mere critique and fact-finding is not a tenable method for investigating the nature of virtue, justice, friendship, or anything else. For what Socrates seeks is the love of wisdom, and not the possession of it." Unquote. The thing Harmon finds epistemologically important about analogy and aesthetics is that they bring the exceptional singularity and autonomy of a thing to cognition. I have written elsewhere that this is actually not too far off from Simondon's allegmatic epistemology. For Harmon, specifically, aesthetics offers the supra-rational, even non-linguistic cognition of ulterior spacious depths, which themselves necessitate the analogical connections. No abstraction, negative or positive, can grasp things themselves. In other words, Harmon draws a line between truth, which is relative and a surface, and reality, which retains its own depths. So Harmon functionally holds that objects are necessary, and all descriptions or relations with them are contingent. But this necessity of such objects can only be viewed, I think, as a sort of crystallization or superstability of contingency itself. In other words, for too long we've looked for the laws of nature behind things rather than through the relations of things themselves. But what does it mean to do justice to things in the ethical, political sense? Surely things cannot be valued and treated equally. Is there any possible notion of applicable justice within a flattened landscape of things? Here, Harmon affirms that things do not anywhere remain equal in value, nor is there any pre-established or ideal forms for things to mimic. Instead, the world of value opens up exclusively through the vast democracy of sensuous attachments made by beings. That is, he speculates that rather than the world being run by blind mechanical laws or an overarching purposive whole, it is discrete, sensuous affinities and the bonds they attract which make up the world we see. He affirms that every affinity and bond thus serves as, quote, bite-sized samples of justice. And further, that ethical vocation forms a new object in its own right, and is not just an external interaction between two permanently separate entities, unquote. Thus, ethics becomes a growing encyclopedia of sorts of the various wagers, commitments, and bonds between things, which create new autonomous objects. In this vision, we see the world as neither laid on a train track toward utopia nor helplessly swirling towards dystopia, but rather the ethical landscape is always a mixed and malleable mesotopia, he calls it. It is worth noting, for this reason, Harmon rejects all radical politics. Consequently, he is often accused of being an enchanting protector of the neoliberal, anti-Marxist status quo. Perhaps more damning is that this philosophy of justice comes down to descriptions of things as they are, rather than any indication of what they could or should become. Finally, on to Mayu. We finally turn to the speculative realist who coined the term correlationism, and who is actually the only one among the original four to write extensively on the theme of justice. In the mere 64 pages translated to English from his long-awaited opus, In Existence Divine, Quentin Mayu mentions justice a whopping 128 times. Even more importantly, his entire body of work drives toward the stated goal of a hope for justice worthy of the name. The first task Mayu sets forth in this grand philosophy is in discerning a new way of justifying our justification of the real. This task is made so difficult because the consensus in modern critical philosophy is correlationist. That is, to think something absolute is to think an absolute for us, and hence not to think anything absolute. This leaves thought vulnerable to the worst kind of religious fanaticism, on one side, and a defeatist secular skepticism on the other. The paradox of our time is thus that the more thought arms itself against dogmatism, he says, the more defenseless it becomes before fanaticism. So let's briefly outline his proposed path out of this terrible stalemate. Throughout his work after finitude, he demonstrates that regardless of whatever thought or content is presently given, even the fiercest skepticism must admit that reality in itself truly could be or become wholly other than we have thought. He then attempts to radicalize this contingency built into the correlationist logic to reveal something about the nature of reality in itself, namely the necessity of contingency of the very laws of nature, the necessary contingency of the very laws of nature. Ultimately, that contingency is the only absolute necessity there is. He famously terms this notion of a lawless sovereign auto-legislator hyperchaos. Hopefully Charles can elaborate here to distinguish Mayu's hyperchaos from, say, the undergirding contradiction that sets off Hegel's ontological project. But helpfully, Mayu presents these climactic arguments against all alternative absolute necessities in familiar theological terms. Most radically, he deduces from his principle of unreason that there could never have been an absolute entity behind all things, because if an infinite perfect God were the source of advent, time would essentially be poor, since what followed this origin could be no better than a diminishing of it. Time is only ever possible because there has never been an absolute sovereignty, nor eternal state of cosmic justice in the past. Time would frankly be impossible, eternally forestalled, for such an absolute would be tantamount, he says, to a black hole of differences, into which all alterity would be irredeemably swallowed up. Such a God could not withstand the emergence of any creation, let alone free agents, as these would irreparably destroy its absolute status. Thus, he says, philosophy amounts to the astonishment that God does not exist. But due to the very same aspect of hyperchaos, the fact that something has never occurred in the past does nothing to outlaw its becoming in the future. Additionally, in a world where the only necessity is contingency, the advent of any law, form, life, or thinking being takes on an almost miraculous, albeit not divinely preordained, character. It is on these grounds that Mayu begins to build his philosophy of justice. First, he describes the advents of hyperchaos into the world around us. From nothing and without reason, there first became that first world of particles, gases, and material laws. Then a second world of organic matter and sensuous life emerged suddenly. Finally, there has been the leap into our present world of reasoning beings, capable of thinking the world wholly other than as given. Here, Mayu actually does see something special and even transcendental in human reason, not baked into our essence, but emergent and contingent. That is, unlike beings before us, we are not constrained by potentials that are bound by the laws derived from experience, but rather, reason can imagine ontologically distinct possibilities, true contingency. In pure virtuality, in effect, what we used to mean by the words necessity and contingency are here downshifted into potential and virtuality. Thus, reason affords, for the first time in being, the capacity to envision absolutes wholly beyond the laws or injuries of the present world. This is so important because, by imagining possibilities, we make them potentials, just as the throw of dice makes the chance itself occur. Naturally, Mayu begins to wonder about a still higher fourth world. What could emerge as far above our present world as life did from inanimate matter? He writes, "The sole possible novelty surpassing humans, just as humans surpass life, would be the recommencement of the human. That is why the fourth world ought to be called the world of justice, for it is only the world of the rebirth of humans that makes universal justice possible, by erasing even the injustice of shattered lives." As an aside, I love that Mayu here calls back to Aristotle's exact example of a necessary truth, that all men are mortal. Even this is ultimately made contingent, simply because it could possibly become otherwise in the future. The aim of this philosophy is ultimately to materialize the divine, to, quote, give birth to God just as matter gives birth to life, as naturally the goal of every philosophy must be the immanent inscription of values in being. This even addresses the theological problem of evil, since because God does not exist yet, if God were to become in the future, this divinity would finally be free of all responsibility for injustices, as it did not create them. I would like to note, despite Mayu's vast originality, that there are precursors to this idea of the virtual becoming of God. Rilke writes beautifully of this notion in A Christmas Letter to a Young Poet, and Simondon similarly mentions a virtual immortality as a sort of psychic center of gravity for the trans-individual collective. In a sense, one may even read a germ of this thought in Diotima's notion that Eros both is and isn't yet a god in the Symposium. Back to Mayu's conception, because God's becoming is not at all preordained and certain, our faith is not a belief, but rather an expression of our own ethos, our own fidelity to certain values. Thus why he states, justice is opposed not to the ignorant, but to the hopeless. That we hope, and what we hope for, defines ethical potential for actual justice. We bear God in our wombs. This is certainly not the mesotopia of Harmon, and what could be further from Brazier's inevitable doomsday than the future literal becoming of heaven on earth? Finally, I must admit, although it can be difficult to envision ways such a faith could be practically applied to daily life, these arguments have not been abstract for me personally. Being an atheist myself, but having grown up in an evangelical church, when I see old friends who are still true believers, we always end up talking late into the night about God, evil, and justice. And Mayu's explicit resolution this combination of radical skepticism and devout faithfulness in this becoming of God through justice, always comes up and always brings new life to an otherwise deathly subject. I'll wrap up with a short thought. I see philosophy as where thought goes to be most boundless, and also where it becomes most constrained. I think even the name speculative realism hit right on these twin dimensions. Speculation unbinds, and realism constrains. All four condemn correlationism precisely for the reason that it wrongly constricts philosophy to the human, and wrongly unbinds philosophy only to deliver it to a circular path in the wilderness. Correlationism draws the wrong decay. And we have found in all four philosophies, in Brazier's destruction of false justice, Grant's defense of nature's sovereignty, Harmon's commitment to a fair hearing for all things, and Mayasu's renewed faith in a justice worthy of the name, that it is never enough to justify our ethos to its correlate with us alone. For while we humans may be the only ones concerned with justice, justice concerns more than humans. At the very least, speculative realism has recovered to thought the autonomy, the self-legislation of the world anew. Holding in mind the unnecessary injuries whose reality is ignored or denied, whether in our own countries, our families, under our bridges, or in Sudan, Syria, or Palestine, I might push this a bit further and make a metaphysical axiomatic out of MLK's statement that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. Thank you.